The theme for the General Grand Finals as well as EFL Grand Finals is morality and ethics. Okay. Time now is 5:57. Debate starts at 6:27. Okay. Motion reads, this House regrets the emphasis on the effortful restraint of one impulses. All right. Good luck and have fun. Welcome to the Grand Finals of YTN 2020 online version. Congratulations in making this far. My name is Jan Galas, your chair for this round. With me are 6 panel. We have Jaehyun, Jaekyung, Onika, Sokjin, and Iksun. All right, on government side, we have Spam, and in opposition, we have archers. All right, with no further ado, let's invite the Prime Minister to propose the topic. Go here.
Hear me?
All right, you good?
Hannah, we believe that the instantaneous choices that an individual will make based on their impulsive responses, is what can change their life for the rest of change their whole lives at the end of the day. We believe that the emphasis of the effortful restraint, that this narrative on restraining one person's impulses was extremely harmful under government side. That is why we are very proud to propose. Before moving on to our arguments, let me clarify a few points in which the government side is arguing under. First, note that this is a regret motion. This is a retrospective motion in which we should evaluate mostly upon the impacts on the human society and the individual's opportunities and restraint. And if we prove to you why this kind of restraint and social narrative deter a lot of the opportunities that the human society and the individuals could have achieved under our counterfactual, where we do not have such strong emphasis of the effort for the restraint of impulses, we can win this debate. So we believe that the time frame here is until the status quo. And we believe that the emphasis on the effort for restraint on impulses means that the society actively tells you that human nature and the human nature to act upon their instincts is bad. The impulses that you act upon is essentially bad and something really, really barbaric in a negative way. Therefore, you have to push it down. So you have to differentiate here between being impulsive and being moral, and being immoral. And we believe that the only narrative, when we can regret this narrative, when we can prove that, number one, in itself, it was immoral, and number two, it was harmful upon society, deterring a lot of opportunities that the individuals and society, the human society could have achieved in the first place. First argument about, in my PM speech, I'm going to bring about to you 2 constructive arguments. Number one, why was it principally wrong and go against the very moral principles, and number 2, if there was no narrative, how the impulsive choices could have impacted the society in a positive way. But first of all, about the principle. So we believe that the value of the impulsive choices in itself is very, very high. So it is in the human instinct to act with their impulses, it is a very humanistic thing to act upon what you think instantly is right or wrong. We believe that the impulse and instinct was the thing that actually led to the humanity surviving at the end of the day. The fight or flight instinct that you had when you actually faced that kind of wild animal in the first place, that is the moment where were actually able to survive in the first place. So we believe that these impulses and instincts are intrinsically acting for your happiness and your self-actualization, and therefore we believe that no one can decide what is more important or what should be more prioritized in your life, because number one, no one is my position or my situation, but number 2, no one has the same priorities or the same importances as me. So we believe that we can characterize different kinds of impulses, right? So we believe that a lot of the basis of the impulses that the human have in the first place are based on moral things. So we believe that even without the emphasis, the instinct to do actively harmful things to other people in our society is very mitigated under our moral instincts or under our moral instincts and the moral impulses that the individuals have. For example, this could be the impulse to like go into that river and save that child who's drowning before weighing the benefits. Oh, what if I catch a cold or whatnot? We believe that once there's an emphasis upon these kind of individuals to actively restrain their instincts, the society puts an emphasis, therefore actively tell you to restrain that the impulsive choice is something you should never do that. Now that is the moment where these individuals actually hesitate, they once think more before making the choice. But third of all, why is it harmful for the individual at the end of the day? So we believe that the impulsive choices are the portrayal of your most fundamental desires and what you want deeply inside your heart at the end of the day. Therefore, that is a moment where this is directly linked to your self-actualization, your happiness, your definition of happiness, your interpretation of what you want to achieve in your life. So, for example, if I don't make the impulsive choice to catch that businessman and actually explain my idea about like Facebook or whatnot, if I don't make that instantaneous choice, I lose that opportunity to get the job promotion from that business. I lose my opportunity to change my life. For example, writing that E in your college administration to like apply for English literature rather than like applying for biology, which apparently applies as more like rational because I have more thoughts in science or whatnot. We believe that those are instantaneous choices are the ones that can cater to the individual's happiness and self-actualization at the end of the day. And these choices are very unique in the status quo because they have the explicit time frame. If you like lose that opportunity, that is the only chance in your life that you can make that instantaneous choice. Therefore, you believe that acting upon your instincts is not something that should be restrained upon the society. But second of all, let's talk about how if this narrative was not present, well, how much better the society would have been. But first of all, we have two layers here. First of all, about innovation, and second of all, about standing up and advocating for social change. For example, minorities or weaker stakeholders. We believe that in terms of innovation, we believe that it is in every human's nature to innovate and making their life better, like exploring new things. For example, like if utilizing fire or like in prehistoric time frames, developing new tools. The nature has been a key to humanity actually developing until this degree. So recently, when there is a strong narrative that your instincts are secondary compared to the society, what the society thinks of you, what you have to be actually rationalized about the benefits and costs, this has a lot of pressure and oppress the human nature to innovate. So before making that new step in science, before changing that small variable that could have led to like such an innovative thing, such an innovative experience that could change human society forever, we believe that is a moment where it hinders innovation, it hinders a lot of the scientific and technical development that we could have achieved. But second of all, about the standing up and advocating for structural change. For example, let's think that you are an employee and being unjustly treated by the corporation. You know that you have to stand up and make the first move, but you're decentralized, you're irrational because you have to make that rational and you have to hesitate before telling your colleague that maybe this is something unjust and maybe this is something that we have to advocate for structural change. We believe that standing up in the first place is a very instantaneous choice that you have to make, but because the society actively presses you to restrain such instincts, it is very harmful for both the individual, both the society. It is principally wrong. We are very proud to oppose.
All right, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. To open the case of the opposition, let's invite the leader of the opposition.
Can you all hear me? All right. Mr. Speaker, we live together, right? Society is a collective bundle of individuals, and that's why we have to compromise certain aspects of our self-greed in order for us to live, in order for us to maximize our own rights or happiness from the first place. I'm going to prove why this is the case in my constructives. But before that, let's rebut the naive claims of Prime Minister. They tell us that impulse is oftentimes moral, so it's not a problem. Two responses. Firstly, moral values, right, are formed based on the societal circumstances or the societal values at the end of the day. That's why we think that only in a society where individuals are enforced the idea that sharing is caring or giving your other rights at the expense in order for you to enjoy greater rights is the exact reason why we believe that we are able to have these kinds of moral values that we have in society. But moreover, we also think that impulsive decisions often lead to unintended harm because those kinds of thought processes are not there. You don't rationally think or calculate the consequences of your actions. And I'm going to prove to you in my setup and when we talk about what are impulses from the first place. So we think that impulses, as team government also agrees, are natural instincts acquired by primitive stages of human civilization, like things like sexual impulses, things like material impulse, where I want to acquire more money than my own neighbor. We think that those are destined to be immoral. Those are destined to harm society at the end of the day. Why? Two reasons. Firstly, we think that they're often illogical and self-centered, mainly because those impulses are a spike of emotion. That means that first, the basic characteristic of individuals are greedy. They only think about themselves, which is going to be my first argument. But moreover, as I talked about, we don't think proper thought process are actually there in order for those individuals to calculate the harms given to society, individuals, and other individuals actually involved in the process. So therefore, we don't think that impulses are going to be beneficial for society at the end of the day. Therefore, we're more than proud to not regret the restraint of these kinds of impulses from the first place. Let's go to my first argument, talking about why societal structures that we live in status quo, as government team talks about, will not exist with the sole focus on impulses. Why? 4 layers. First, we think that what kind of society do we live in? We live in a society where people make compromises. People decide not to commit crime because of those kinds of restraining their individual impulses, because they think that by myself restraining my own impulses to not rape that person, I am giving society general utility. I'm giving society more protection. But why do we think that that's good? Because it defines a set of rules you should abide by society, and therefore less individuals are actually harmed by the selfish actions, the impulsive actions of individuals. Then, why would this be important without the restraints on impulses? 2 reasons. Firstly, we think that in a natural state, we see individuals becoming a war of all men against all men. So we think that for people to live with maximizing their interest and happiness, some rights have to be compromised, and that's the whole purpose of why the government exists, right? That's why individuals give certain parts of their rights in order to protect them, in order for the government to actually protect their rights in the first place. But moreover, let's look at why it actually harms the minorities from the first place. 2 reasons. Firstly, let's say that those are impulses. We think that the moment they prioritize impulses, team government is denying democracy. Why? Because according to my instincts, according to my impulses, it is not my desire to give up more values, more these kinds of material wealth that I have in order for the poor to be benefited of. That is not my impulse. Therefore, I'm going to object welfare, but moreover, I'm going to object the fundamental idea that everyone deserves 1 vote, because it's my impulse to have more power, to have more authority over another individual. Therefore, that's exactly why the moment where they think, the moment where they prioritize and glorify impulses, they are denying, they are rejecting the premise of democracy, they are rejecting the premise of harmony within individuals who are actually different. But moreover, these individuals only think of the short term, because if you don't restrain from your impulses and you just follow what's good for you, like stealing from that neighbor because I think that can increase my material wealth, as they talk about those spike of emotions, you think that those individuals are not going to think about the consequences of their actions. They're simply going to follow what they actually want at that moment. We don't want that. Therefore, we think that the moment where team government likes impulses, they're denying the very premise, they're denying the very society that we live in, because it is not my natural instinct, it is not my natural impulse to give more rights, to give more ideas for other individuals that we live together. Let's go to my second argument about these kinds of demotivating society to progress sustainably. Two layers of analysis. First, let's look at property. They talk about innovation. We don't think innovation happens in the first place in a world where these kinds of impulses are so prioritized because my efforts aren't going to be rewarded in the first place. It's my impulse to take another thing from another individual that looks better than myself. So therefore, we're going to live in a pariah capitalism state where those individuals, if they think that another individual's product is better than mine, I'm going to take it because it's my impulse and I don't have to restrain it as Team Government said. But secondly, let's look at MNCs or powerful firms. It's their impulse to exploit and take advantage of any sort of demands, any sort of opportunity or resources that happen within these kinds of poor people. Then I'm going to exploit that. I'm not going to restrain my impulses. And that's why we create a harmful society. That's why they reject democracy more than proud to oppose.
All right, saying the leader of the opposition would like to call the Deputy Prime Minister.
May I begin?
Yes, you're okay.
Wait, can I have the paper? Okay. Judge, our burden is not to prove to you that all impulses are not evil nor harmful, right? If we prove to you that this narrative itself and this emphasis on effortful restraint of one impulse itself led to significant amount of social harms as clearly elaborated by our first speaker, and how it would have been better if we didn't have this emphasis in our society. We win this debate and they lost in today's debate, right? Having this clear, ladies and gentlemen, let's move into my rebuttal. I'm going to talk about two main things. First, about why this benefits society in general, and second of all, I'm going to talk about benefits for the individuals and especially about the people who are in a weaker position, for instance, workers, as they fail to elaborate upon this point in today's debate. First, let's talk about how this benefits society in general and why this restraint of one's impulses itself was actually harmful for our society. Claims coming from opposition is this: that the people's impulse itself is necessarily bad and people are so greedy. First of all, Mr. Madam Speaker, the premise of their case itself is that individuals are also greedy, right? We like that itself is unlikely, and that itself is untrue in today's day. Them just simply assuming that every individuals are all greedy, every individuals are all selfish itself was unclarified and what itself was very unresponsive in the first place. So thank you, sir. We like sharing. Maybe Elo does not. We still believe that people have the moral impulses and moral conscience as well. We do not think that impulse itself simply goes against that characterization in the first place, right? But number two, the premise of the characterization that they bring to us is that people will go raping if there is if there was no narrative or no emphasis on impulses and restraining those impulses in the first place. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we say that is not the case in the first place, right? What stops raping itself is another impulse that makes people to believe that it is wrong to rape that woman, it is wrong to kill that person. We think that impulse itself can exist together, and we think that coexistence itself is very important, right? But thirdly, no thank you guys. Because we live in community, as they will like to clarify in today's debate. Because we live in community, there are other people with different impulses in the first place, right? Whereas you as a bad people, as they characterize as who to be greedy, there can be bad people existing on both sides of the house. The reason why when individuals have impulses better and when there's emphasis itself is worse is because there are individuals in our society who have moral impulses, right? Whereas Elo or people in their side of the house may be so greedy. There are people who are kind as well, who can actually prevent those individuals because they have the impulse to stand up, because they have the impulse to protect the victim, because they have the impulse to protect the child that is drowning in the water. That is the a unique benefit that we give to. And we feel that the moment that they only emphasize like effortful restraint on one's impulse, this is the moment at which, no thank you sir, individuals fear about such things. Individuals are afraid that they will be penalized by the society or get attacked. And we that this impulse itself is what enables the individuals to make change and go further, right? This was at best not responded by their side of the house. And number two, let's talk about why this is going to be beneficial and why the emphasis itself was extremely harmful for the individuals and why the emphasis itself is very regrettable, right? The case coming from their side is that there are people who want like democracy, about democratic issues, like people want all power at once, and people are going to reject democracy and harmony. Mr. Speaker, several layers of responses. First of all, my impulse is not all malicious, as we previously clarified. But number two, that if individuals are so greedy in the first place, the amount of emphasis they put on restraint will be so extreme under their calculation, right? No, thank you, sir. The amount of restraint that they would have to put under their side of the house would be like making people to not be able to feel their impulse itself is beneficial, nor they're going to continuously question whether my impulse is right. They're going to continuously question whether my belief upon this impulse itself is right in the first place. We think that itself is going to be extremely harmful because the harms elaborated by our first speaker is this. A, we can clearly see how the innovation itself is going to be further deterred. B, we can clearly see how this is going to less have chances for individuals to empower the minorities, empower the workers in the first place, who are in a comparatively weaker position, right? We think that the moment that they put more emphasis upon these restraining itself is the moment at which the entire harm itself is going to be further strengthened. We think that is the reason why at the end of the day, I'm just simply saying that this is going to go against democracy itself with falling in today's way. Lastly, let's talk about them saying about this petite thing, such as my work itself is not going to be important like states and about all of those petite things, right? First of all, Mr. Madam Speaker, people have demands. Yes, we agree, right? People have demands, right? I want to eat hamburger right now, meaning that I have demand as well. But other people living in our society have demand as well. We think that is the reason why this impulse of every individual itself can differ by every individual. So we think that is the reason why individuals tend to make compromises, even if we do not necessarily emphasize on effortful restraint on one's impulses in general, because they have different values. That is the reason why they are likely to make compromises as well, because they live in a collective society, as they will like to characterize, and they love so much in today's day. We think that is the reason why this emphasis itself was not only A, unnecessary when we understand that this benefit itself can also exist, but B, even if you assume that there are going to be harms such as crimes existing in our society, as they never provided you with any kind of mechanism as to why this emphasis actively led to the decrease of crime existing in our society. They cannot just simply take that point by saying that this is beneficial for solving crimes. So now let's move into my argument. We're going to talk about why we protect minorities better and people in weaker positions. This is going to be further extending from the point of our first speaker. Two layers of analysis. First of all, we think that social change is hard and chance of success is extremely low, right? We think that for the Black Lives Matter movement to prosper in our society itself was a difficult challenge in the past, and it is easier by now because there were a lot of people who had power to go on. We thought the reason why the number itself was comparatively smaller than our counterfactual, or the world that we would have lived if the emphasis did not exist, is because we thought this actively deters the individuals because they fear that, oh, my impulse might be wrong, or maybe I should listen to the society, what the society is telling me. We think that itself is extremely beneficial because oftentimes minorities lack in number. Minorities lack in number of power that they have in our society. We think that itself is especially true because that itself is important because we know when there was emphasis that actually makes people to feel that their impulse is wrong, to feel that their impulse is irrational, because that is the moment at which these minorities cannot be better protected. We're more than happy to propose today's motion.
All right, we thank that speaker. We'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
May I begin?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Madam Speaker, in today's debate, the burden of side government was to give us a clear reason of why there are so much harms in current society, which is a society that emphasizes the effortful restraint of one's impulses. Side government had to tell us why there were so many problems in current society. So therefore, we should regret the decision of the current society, emphasizing the effortful restraint of one's impulses. However, side opposition's burden was to prove to you why these kind of society's decision to actually control and restrain one's impulses led to correct historical decisions and therefore led to the prosperity of our society. Now, with that clear, let's directly move on to the rebuttals. Side opposition told us that all of these people's impulses are not incorrect and not all immoral. We agree upon this point. We clearly agree that people's impulses doesn't need to be immoral at all times. However, what we're like to tell you is that even if impulses are moral decisions, it can still lead to unintended harms. For example, let's look at the drowning child example they gave us. They told us when a child is drowning, it could be a moral impulse of someone to just jump right in. We think that that impulse is not necessarily immoral. However, it could lead to unintended harms. For example, those people might have needed to consider whether they call 911, whether they have physical strength enough to actually pull the child out of the water. They need to consider whether they are not going to drown with the child. We think that all of this kind of thinking and can only happen when we restrain one's impulses. Yes, we agree that these kind of impulses to jump into the water is not a bad thing. However, because if you do not restrain those impulses, if you do not give it logical thinking, because it is going to lead to unintended results that lead to more harms at the end of the day, we think that is exactly why we need to restrain our impulses and think logically before changing that action, before actually doing those kind of actions, right? Now, another point, second point coming from side opposition is that there are people with more, and to further explain about the point about how there are people with more impulses, we think that these are clear minorities. Why? We think that is it easy for us to share food with others when we're hungry? No, our impulses says that I should eat all of the food because I'm so hungry and I'm going to be more hungry if I share my food. However, the reason why people share food at the end of the day is because they consider other implications, like moral implications. They consider other people's situation. They consider how they'll end up being if I do not share my food. And they think that in cost of my hunger, if I could save another person's life, then we think that this, by reaching a logical conclusion, by restraining one's impulses, we think that these are the decisions that lead to correct decisions, right? Now, the third argument was about how this is going to lead to better protection of minorities. Now, we clearly tell you that when peoples meet actual minorities, it is not the people's impulse to reach out and help them. For example, in a society, if there are people with different color, or if there are people with different physical shapes, do you think that it really is people's impulses to reach out to them? No, we think that it is the people's impulses to be afraid and segregate them. Why is that so? People's first thought is that those people are different from me. Those people do not belong in our society because they're clearly different. We think that this kind of impulses actually leads to the segregation of minorities, not a very happy and well collaborated society, right? The reason why we're helping minorities is because we need to consider all of the benefits of compromising our fear, reaching out to those minorities, so we can create a much more collaborative society, right? We think that those are the exact reasons why this kind of minorities are actually going to be better protected in a society where we actually restrain one's impulses. But more importantly, let's look at important moments in history when restraint of one's impulses actually led to much beneficial results. One of the biggest examples we can give you are wars. We think that during wars, it is people's impulses to protect themselves. It is people's impulses to not go into the war because obviously every human impulse dictates that I do not want to die. It is every human's biggest fear. Every human's biggest fear is actually death. However, we need to look at the reasons why these kind of soldiers so bravely jump into wars. It's because they restrain one's impulses. They restrain their impulse of fearing death. However, because they consider more things, for example, protection of their family, protection of their country, protection of ideologies like democracy, we think those are the reasons these people are able to actually commit those kind of brave actions. Can this happen in a world of side opposition, side government, Mr. Madam Speakers? No, it is impossible. No, thank you, ma'am. We think that it is impossible because if everyone just relies on impulses, it is obviously going to lead to results like them running away from war, which directly leads to the team's last argument why evading responsibility is so easy in a society that regrets the emphasis of effortful restraint of one's impulses. Now, we think that responsibility and controlling one's impulses can be very difficult for people. Why? We told you it could lead to so many harms for that individual. Because every human goal is to sustain myself and like the most precious one around me. If there's decisions then we need to take certain responsibility, but we need to compromise our benefits. We think that if people do not control their responses, control their impulses, obviously they will only take the short-term benefits and evade responsibility. The example we gave you about the war, we think that if people were really did not restrain their impulses, then obviously they will not jump into the war. They will not volunteer to fight for their country. Why? Because their impulse is to run away with their family and hide in a safe place. Because their protection, their priority is their own safety, is their family's safety, right? I think that this is the exact reason why, if we do not restrain one's impulses, it is going to lead to a society where people are just ignoring these kind of responsibilities for their own personal benefits. So, Mr. Madam Speaker, if I give you a world comparison at the end of the day, I think that our society was still able to develop even with the restraint of one's impulses. The reason why scientific development still happen is because scientists now get to consider whether my inventions are really going to be beneficial for the world or not. They get to consider if my inventions is actually going to lead to more benefits or more harms. This kind of time to consider actually lead to much more better inventions, because if scientists simply invented without thinking the consequences, then it could have led to much more detrimental results, right? We think that even in a society where we restrain one impulses, those kind of scientific development or like individual creativity or not will still be achieved. However, the biggest harms coming from side government is that people can always evade responsibilities. People can always put their greed over other people's benefits and over collaborative societies, because obviously it is the human's impulse to sustain myself. My survival, my individual survival is the impulse that every human have, right? So unless side government can prove us why this is wrong, we think that our side clearly takes this debate home, and for these reasons, I'm more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
Right, we thank the previous speaker. Would like to move on to the government whip. All right, before we move on, I'd just like to check, are all judges good to go? All right, okay, awesome. All right, let's move on when the speaker is ready.
From the very start of history, humans had no education, right? They had various instincts which showed out in the form of impulsive actions. You had the instinct to kill that mammoth in order for me to survive. You had an instinct to mourn for the dead around you. You had the instinct to save my child and myself from danger. And you also had that instinct to find out new creative ways to survive, right? That's why we think that instincts don't necessarily have anything to do with the society that surrounds you. That's why we think that instincts are not necessarily only evil or only good. That's why we think that there are various instincts that exist in our society from the very beginning of history, right? That's why we think that impulses are not necessarily formed by the society around you, which was the first thing that Ella wanted to say to our case, right? What is formed by the society around you is your rational calculus, but an impulse is what comes out in a split-second decision before that thought passes your rational calculus. That's why we think this has something more to do with what people thought at the very beginning of history in the first place, right? We think that we win this debate when we prove to you why that kind of emphasis on like the restriction of these kind of impulses was an immoral thing and was a harmful thing to our society. We think that they cannot win this debate at the end of the day, because the only thing that they tell you is that restriction is good. They never tell you why there needs to be a social emphasis on that kind of effortful restriction. They never tell you why it has to be that excessive in the first place, right? So I have two questions in my speech. First one's going to prove to you on why it is moral to emphasize you. Whether it is moral to emphasize you restricting your nature as human. Second one's going to be about which team better brings the better society, right? So firstly, going on to my first clash. When we win the clash about morality, we prove to you why that emphasis was immoral in nature, which that itself is the strongest reason why it should be regrettable, because it's immoral according to our humanistic values, right? So the first thing they proposed to us in this debate was, it's right to compromise your impulse because it has everything to do with the society, democracy, and people around you, right? But we think that it's false because it's not your excessive restraints that lead to democracy, right? Because we think that restraining an impulse means that you have to hide what you want, but we think that that's not the nature of democracy in the first place, right? But we think that from the very past, humans' impulses wasn't focused on getting everything that you want. Yeah. We think the human impulse is focused on you making the best of the situation, and I'm going to explain to you why exactly that is so. If you want to kill your friend because you're hungry, we think that you have two instincts that clash inside of you, right? The instinct that you want to kill and you want to eat, and the instinct that you don't want to kill someone that shares your human race, that you don't want to kill someone that you love and value and respect, right? That's why we think that your decisions are made on a calculus according to various instincts that you have inside of yourself. We don't necessarily think that impulse itself is a harmful thing or a bad thing, right? But we think that is the moment where our society still stands because it's not an emphasis on restraint that makes people share, right? Democracy still stands on our side because it's a conflict of diverse impulses that come to a middle point, right? That when people want to make the best out of the situation that they have right now, we think that is the moment where democracy is better achieved under our side because we don't think that there needs to be excessive restraint on what you want. We think that democracy is there for you to propose what you want in society, right? We think that is the moment where we better achieve those societal values, right? But even if you assume that impulses are super, super bad, if you're talking about impulses to kill and dictate, we can regulate that without that emphasis on you restraining your impulse, right? Because that is an impulse that creates extreme societal harms. We think that can be controlled with the necessary that can be controlled without that emphasis in the first place. But we think that what's more is that is already controlled with a conflicting impulse on the other side, right? When you have the impulse to kill another individual, someone in the society has that impulse to stop you from killing the same human being that we share the race upon, that we love each other upon, right? We think that when we have conflicting impulses in the first place, we don't necessarily think that regulation and that necessary emphasis on restraining is needed for them to stand at the end of the day. So what we don't understand is they never prove to us why that emphasis is moral in the first place, right? Even if we concede to everything, we don't understand why that is the necessarily moral point, right? That's why we win the first class, because we prove to you why it's immoral for you to be restrained as you following your humanistic natures. We think that we're the ones that take the class on why it should be moral, right? But then the second class is going to be about who better brings the better society, right? We think that every single breakthrough through our society was actually achieved because you were the one actually achieved by the people who follow their impulses to change, right? We think that as I previously told you, we think that humans have a basic impulse to make their situation better in diverse ways, right? But the reason why this doesn't work in our society and in their society is for various reasons, right? In a society that restricts you from speaking out according to your impulse. For example, let's say that you're trying to stand up for social protection issues or whatnot, right? Before standing up, you would think one more time, how will the society react to what I say, right? It's your impulse to stand up and talk about it, but then you'll think one more time, what are the social impacts? What is the society going to tell me? What if the society tells me that this is wrong, right? Because when you rethink that as a calculus, that is the moment where you lose the ability to actually take out your human instinct and actually change the society, right? We think that those kind of innovations can happen under their side because every single time a person tries to think of a different way to innovate in human nature, they'll always think, oh, will this make money in society? Oh, will society accept my innovations? We don't necessarily think that those kinds of restrictions are beneficial for the innovations in the first place, right? That's why we therefore think that the better society achieved is under our side, where we allow for those conflicting impulses to actually impulses to have a natural check and balance, but we do not want that kind of excessive amount of restriction on your impulse. We think that is what deters innovation. We're more than proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, we thank the previous speaker and would like to apologize for the technical error. Yeah, apologies about that. Let's move on. Let's have the next speaker to continue the debate.
Okay, so basically both sides conceded to the fact that human impulse has been consistent throughout history, and human impulse itself, by its very definition, is that it's an impulse and it's something that you just have this imminent feeling, and that emphasis is very important. That is why we think that when the opposition side, the proposition side has been questioning us and questioning proposition that has questioning us, the opposition side, but why this debate is about the emphasis of this effortful restraint or whatnot. We have been debating about that motion because we think that this is, regardless of like emphasis or definition, we think that because human instinct itself is that both sides conceded to the fact that human instinct itself, impulse, is very powerful from the first place. That is why the proposition side benefits exist from the first place, because without this very strong impulse, without thinking twice or whatnot, that itself is why their benefits are brought. We think that both sides are conceding that is why emphasis is very important from the first place. That is why the opposition side has been debating for the entire time how emphasis is very important, and just an emphasis of restraint itself is what we have been debating so far, and that question itself is invalid for the entire debate. So having that set very clear, let's move on to the first and second clash point. So my first clash point is going to be about, regardless of whether this impulse is immoral or moral, how is each stance and each model coming from each side going to be promoting a better and more moral society. But second clash point about the practical benefits like innovation and economic benefits. So first clash point about which side's better promoting and better supporting the moral society, regardless of this immoral or moral impulse or whatnot. We think that because the emphasis of conscious restraint is very important from the first place, we want to talk about how to compare and contrast the both cases. So basically, proposition side logic is very simple. They're saying that, oh, we can compromise each other's impulse, collide to each other, that they're conflicting to each other and contradictory to each other, and also people will think about how society will view themselves. Let me ask them, how is that so different from restraint and emphasis of restraint from our case? Because what we see coming from the team proposition side is that when these colliding restraints and colliding impulses collide to each other, we think that in these kind of cases, when they think and consider about how society will view them and how society will criticize them, that itself is restraint from the first place. That is why we think that their policy, their stance or model itself was flawed from the first place. But what the opposition side was talking about was that we question about how in democratic society, in our society, how constitutions are guaranteed. That itself is equal and an example and direct example of emphasis of conscious restraint. Because as I talked about, both sides conceded to the fact that human instinct and impulse is very, very powerful. That is why we think that because the emphasis itself equals to constitution, they had to prove to us why it's so different from our society. The only response coming from the government, which is pretty late, was that, oh, democracy should not be about concealing free discourse and hindering and halting the free discourse in the first place. So, okay, let's say that democracy, we concede to the fact that, of course, democracy is also about free discussion and whatnot. But if that free discussion leads to third-party harm, that is, we have more than enough justification to hinder and halt that free discourse or whatnot. That is why we think that even if they have impulse or whatnot, and that's going to be leading to free discourse, we have more than enough justification to ban that or to prohibit that as the government. But they also talked about how, second point coming from the proposition side was about how, okay, there aren't only immoral impulse, but there's also moral impulse. Okay, we can see to the fact that immoral impulse and moral impulse both exist. For example, first of all, they talked about how there are colliding impulses. For example, there are people who want to rape that person, who rape a woman or whatnot, and there's also another person who has this impulse to stop that raping in that circumstance. So, for example, what if that worsens that raping incident and raping circumstance, the person who's raping? Because how can they stop them by just simply barging in without thinking how they're going to be stopping them? If there are 10 gangsters surrounding a woman, how are they going to be stopping them more effectively? That is why we think that restraint itself is very important from the first place. But second of all, okay, let's concede to the fact that harm exists and moral impulse exists or whatnot. We think that even if immoral and moral impulse exist from the first place, simultaneously exist, we think that if harm exists from the first place, immoral impulse that harms others, which they conceded to that point too, that it harms others, we think that there's more than enough justification for the government to prohibit, to restrict that impulse, because in any cases, that harm can also exist. And if that harm leads to significant amount of third-party harm, which is directly infringing upon a democratic value, because democracy in society or any community itself is not just simply you as an individual living all alone on an island. It's about everyone congregating and everyone cooperating with each other. That is why we think that if harm exists, the government has more than enough justification to ban and prohibit that. Having that set very clear, let's move on to the second clash point about the innovation and practical benefits. So our first speaker talked about in this first and second argument. The second argument about how there are practical benefits to the economy. So their logic was simple. Their second argument was about how impulse is going to be leading to innovation and whatnot. So let's think about the innovation. Okay, if we can see to the fact that they have innovation, like benefits from innovations because of impulse and creativity, whatnot. So let's say that startup companies who want to start up a company, okay, they might have good idea or creative idea from the first place. But that's not just it, because you have to think about how your startups, just simply thousands of people having an impulse of having a light bulb just stucking in and having a very good idea. That's not just going to be simply reviving these kind of economy, because startup companies cannot be just simply creatures, adventures that they can just simply think that they can dive in and barge into the economy and just simply establish a company or whatnot. That is not the benefit that we want to pursue. Economy is not just simply about speculation or any of these kind of startup companies just thinking that they have a great idea and they want to start up a new company. It's also about long-term policies and long-term benefits and long-term profit-oriented companies that they can actually pursue, which also in the end helps the economy overall. That is why we think that the first and second clash point, we take our house, and the opposition house obviously takes it home. And for these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
All right, thank you, favorite speaker. Would like to invite the opposition reply speaker.
May I begin?
Yes, you may.
Mr. Massacre, just 12 minutes ago, I gave the same introduction about how the burden of proposition is to prove to us and tell us why current society is so detrimental, and our current society actually puts an emphasis on effortful restraint of one's impulses, and we're seeing no responses coming from side opposition, right? However, what was our burden? Our burden was to tell you why we don't regret the emphasis, because it led to correct social decisions that made people in our society more happier. It led us to a democratic society that ended up as a very successful one. And now I would like to give you the two main reasons why side opposition takes space to it home. Number one was about the democratic society. Now, side government told us that these kind of society can be also created under their world, because there are people who actually does make moral decisions and have moral impulses, and because these clashes and conflicts of impulses can lead to a democratic society. However, Mr. Massacre, we think that when we yield, when we give up, when we compromise, we think that we do so there's the least amount of unhappy people in society. However, why does people do so? We think that people can only give up their benefits. People only can give up their greed when they actually restrain their impulses. We think that it is every human individual's impulse to achieve their maximum amount of happiness. So in certain instances, if I see someone else's product, if I see someone else's weapon or like jewelry that is more shinier than mine, we think that it is the human impulse to want it and make it as mine. However, the reason why people are able to restrain these kind of impulses is because but the reason why people don't steal from others, the reason why people do not commit these kind of crimes is because they consider certain implications. They consider social implications. They consider a lot of factors. Therefore they restrain their impulse to, which is, I want that for mine. I think that is why this control of impulses is what leads to a democratic society. Because in a democratic society, people always have to yield and make compromises. We think that this is impossible when there's no restraints of impulses, right? So therefore, when it comes to a democratic and moral society, we think this can all only be achieved on our side. About the second reason why these kind of society can only exist, we think that there are also no responses about the war examples we gave you. We clearly told you that it is every human impulse to fear death and to fear going into the war zones. However, the reason why we can maintain a democratic society is because there were brave people who sacrificed themselves for society by restraining their impulses. They restrained their impulses of running away and not protecting democracy, but ended up saving our society and continuing our society because they restrained their impulses in order for social benefits, right? I think that those are the exact reasons why our society can only be protected on our side. Second issue was social innovation. They told us social innovation is exclusive benefit coming from side government because these kind of scientists, it's their impulses to like create new things, and if there impulses are like restrained, then this is not going to happen. We think that this is not true. We clearly told you that scientific and social innovation still happens because just because you have restrained impulses doesn't mean that the impulses are actually gone, right? Scientists now get to consider the implications of their creations. They can consider whether my inventions are actually going to be beneficial for other people rather than just creating it just because they felt an impulse to do so, right? We think that this is exactly why scientific and social development is still going to happen on our side, but it is going to happen in a much more moral and effective way, right? Moreover, because on their side, if others want my scientific innovation, if they think it is better than mine, we think it is the people's impulse to go and get it. So therefore, even if scientific innovations happen in a world by side government, we think this is still going to be detrimental because people are going to fight over it because they can't control their impulses and they don't restrain the impulses. More than opposed. Thank you.
All right, thank that speaker. To close this debate, we'd like to invite the government reply speaker.
May I begin? Time. The reason why our society was able to develop this far, develop farms, gathering communities, or etc., although there were these constraints and restraints regarding their impulse itself, was because there were individuals who had enough courage, who had enough confidence to actively engage in these innovative activities and ideas. We think that if there weren't those restraints existing, we think that it would have been much more easier for other people to involve in these activities as well. But most importantly, judges, we believe that side opposition's burden was not to prove that there is a restraint necessary and there are crimes, right? The entire comparison coming from side opposition is contingent upon our worst case scenario of crime rampant society versus their best case scenario where all citizens are law abiding and suddenly have innovative ideas as well. Because the moment that they try to compare only our worst case and their best case itself was very, very unfair, and the comparison itself should not be bought in the first place. Two main criteria as to why we win this debate and why they have to be used. First of all, why we can generate greater goals, right? Our moral principle, as elaborated by our Prime Minister, which we heard no response to whatsoever in today's debate, was regarding how individuals' happiness is important, and because it's subjective and differs by individuals, that emphasis on restraining impulse itself is emphasizing that social good is more important than your choice, right? Note that this is directly responding toward their case about we are war example, right? Because there's a view that when it comes to this war itself, the reason why this is problematic is I need to be drafted to the military. I need to go fight for the war for my country when my method of happiness is stripped away, right? Maybe I prefer to spend more time with my family. Maybe I prefer to spend more time with my lovely daughter. But because of their side of the house and because of them stripped away their impulse itself, and because of those restraints, they're setting out this standard that social happiness is more important than your own happiness. And we think that itself is also bad, as we've clearly clarified from our first. Then second, let's talk about the necessity of emphasis when we've clearly characterized how we can better generate the greater goals that the individuals and the society should generate in the first place. Secondly, about the necessity of emphasis. As the motion clearly states states, we can clearly see how there is a word emphasis in the first place. Here's why they lose in today's debate, because they cannot just simply get away with their burden on proving emphasis just by saying that impulse is strong, so restraints are also strong. An emphasis means putting more than usual, right? So even if an impulse is strong, their burden was to prove why the restraint itself has to be stronger. They fail to elaborate upon that point, right? If they just simply say that impulse is strong, therefore restraint should be stronger, we that itself did not provide to you any kind of mechanism or meaningful ways as to prove that there was a clear necessity of emphasis in the first place, right? But lastly, regarding the point regarding democratic nations, right? As a whip clearly provided to you, there are like healthy discussions that are needed in democratic nations. And we think that itself is going to be further hindered because the individual's innovative ideas itself is going to be deterred. The moment that they say that individuals are so greedy, the moment that they say individuals are so selfish, well, the moment at which restraint itself is going to be further strengthened is the moment at which any kind of innovative ideas itself that is necessary for our society to reach the development that we could have made, we could have been if there were no, if these restraints did not exist. Because that is the reason why by their side of the house, them just simply comparing the moral and immoral values about these kind of impulse itself was the reason why they lose this debate, and they fail to provide their burden regarding the necessity of emphasizing in today's debate. We're more than happy to win this debate and propose. Thank you.
All right, we thank the previous speaker and everyone. Thank you for that interesting speeches. Results will be announced during the closing ceremony. All right, so good luck, take a rest, and we'll see you